The second gen Husqvarna motorcycles are now in India and many things have changed this time around, including the fact that we now get the 401 models. That means that this bike has the 399cc engine from the bigger KTMs. However, it's only available in one version, the Svartpilen 401. Now, one of the key changes with this new generation model is that it's a more sensibly sized motorcycle. The Gen 1 Husqvarnas had a really tall seat. It was 842 mm. That number is now down to 820. And to show you what it's like, I'm going to call Ashley in here to give you an example. Ashley is 5 feet 6 inches tall, so he's quite average height. And he finds himself on the balls of his feet. He's not exactly on tiptoes, but he's not completely flat foot either. Thanks, Ashley. Thanks for showing us what that looks like. Ashley tells me that this is a motorcycle he thinks he could manage quite well because it's rather slim, it's not very heavy. But the thing to note here is that this is still not a short motorcycle, it's a shorter bike than before. And if a seat height is very important to you, you might want to look at the new KTMs because they have a lower seat than that. But it's not just good news for shorter riders. If you're someone tall, someone large, you will find things to like here as well. For one, this is a more spacious bike than the one it replaces, and it's definitely more spacious than the new 390 Duke. If you're a big rider, there is room for you to move around and you don't feel locked in. The riding position is also a little wider, although we'll get back to more details on the riding position in a bit. But in general, this feels like a more comfortable, more accommodating, and definitely a larger bike. Now, Bajaj tells us that this motorcycle is about 20% longer and wider than before. The number that stands out to me is that the fuel tank is nearly 5 inches wider. And that means when you're sitting on the bike, it doesn't feel like you're on a sort of toy motorcycle. This feels much larger than before. It feels substantial. It's not big by any means, but it is a substantial feeling bike. Now, these increases in the motorcycle size have brought along improvements in the practicality as well. For example, the old fuel tank was just 9.5 litres. This has grown to 13.5 litres. It's not as much as the 15-litre tank in the KTM, but it's pretty practical and quite usable. Then you have new things like a windscreen out here, which gives you a little wind protection on the highway. We've already talked about the spaciousness, and there's better room for a pillion as well. It is worth pointing out that despite the substantial increase in size, this new Svartpilen 401 is only 5 kilos heavier than the previous gen Svartpilen 250, and that's quite impressive. Unfortunately, some of the practical aspects that have come on this new gen model have taken away some sense of style. Now, one of my favorite aspects of the old Husqvarnas was that chopped rear end with the hugger and the number plate all down at the back of the tire. This time around, Husqvarna tells us they've had feedback from customers in India, customers in Europe, that while it looked good, it sent a lot of muck and filth back onto the motorcycle, onto the pillion seat and onto the rider's back. So now you have a more traditional rear fender, and while I'm sure it works much better than the old system, I can also tell you it doesn't look anywhere close to as special. Now, even though this Gen 2 model has some more conventional, boring looking details like the fender and this rather uninspiring looking grab handle, there are still many other elements that look good on this motorcycle and that are completely unique to Husqvarna with that Swedish minimal theme. For example, I love this foot peg holder for the rear pillion pegs. I think that looks great. There is a neat curve in how the fender integrates with the rest of the motorcycle. You have that trademark Husqvarna long tank panel, this thing up here. The flow of the seat, it is very identifiable as a Husqvarna. The same goes for the headlamp. This is a round unit like before with a very neat LED ring. It does look good from a distance, but when you inspect it up close, the side plastics look a little dark grey, black, not as neat as the old headlamp. Speaking of finish, things are generally quite good. I like the look of the panels, these little details out here, the radiator shroud, it looks nice. But this is a more naked motorcycle than the KTM. There's more on display, and that's always a hard thing to package neatly. For example, you can see these wires for the horn, the radiator fan is a little more exposed. You can't really hide these things too well if you want a completely minimal naked design, but these are some things that you will notice. Now, just like before, the Husqvarnas are based on the KTM platform, and in case you're wondering what's shared and what's different, it's really quite simple. All of this is the same. The main frame, the motor, and even the suspension is the same that you will find on the KTM 390 Duke. What's different here, obviously, is the bodywork completely. The subframe is different. The KTM has a nice cast aluminum subframe. This is a simpler tubular steel subframe. And of course, the wheels and tires. We'll talk about that in a bit. Now this Svartpilen 401 uses the same engine from the KTM 390 Duke, but if you want the Vitpilen with its white bodywork, that motorcycle is available in India only with a smaller engine from the KTM 250 Duke. The Vitpilen looks very similar, but it is positioned more as a roadster and it gets alloy wheels, street tires, a simpler LCD display and a slightly lower handlebar position. We haven't ridden that bike yet and it will be a separate story for the future. But essentially, those are the differences, and if you want the bigger 401 engine, you have to go for the Svartpilen. Now speaking about 401, this is one of the most powerful engines you can get in almost any Indian motorcycle. 46 horsepower, 38 Newton meters of torque. We know it from the KTM, it is a sharp, powerful thing. Here's what it sounds like in the Husqvarna. No surprises there, pretty much exactly what you'd get in the KTM, and the character of the engine is also pretty much exactly the same. It's a slightly rough, not very sweet sounding engine at low revs, but when you rev it out it has an angry tone to it, very encouraging. Unfortunately, like the KTM 390 Duke, there are some clear vibrations in the foot pegs and the handlebar depending on the engine RPM. Fortunately, also like the KTM, this bike is so excitingly quick that you won't be thinking about the vibrations when you whack the throttle open. This engine does like being revved out. The power is all up top, 6000 RPM onwards, really powerful bike. When we tested the new 390 Duke, we got a 5.2 second 0 to 100 time, which is the quickest of any Indian bike we've tested to date. And this Svartpilen 401 surely won't be much slower than that. The only difference is that it's about 2-3 kilos heavier than the KTM and it's running different tires. Now, this engine, while it is all about aggressive top-end performance, it's a lot more tractable than the Gen 2 KTMs. You can hold third gear at 20 kilometers an hour, you can potter around in fourth, fifth at lower speeds, and that just makes it easier to ride. It is definitely an easier engine to get along with than the older KTMs. The bike also gets an up and down quick shifter, and like on the KTM, this works quite nicely above 4000 RPM, but it can be a bit clunky at low revs. In fact, speaking of features, this bike has most of what you'll find in the 390 Duke, but not everything. The TFT display, for example, has a completely different layout. It's quite nice and it is quite customizable. You can reduce the amount of information you want on the display if you like. You have switchable ABS, you can turn off the rear ABS, you can turn off the traction control. But unlike the KTM, you don't get riding modes. Now the screen does show riding mode, but it's only street mode. You don't get anything else. And you don't get launch control. The reason that these features are missing is because the Husqvarna does not get an IMU, and that means that it also misses out on the KTM's lean angle sensitivity in the ABS and the traction control. The Husqvarna also doesn't get Bluetooth connectivity, but that can be purchased as an optional extra. So that's what the performance of the Husqvarna Svartpilen 401 is like, but now let's talk about the handling, and things are a little unusual and interesting in this regard. Now this motorcycle is pitched as a sort of scrambler themed thing. You've got the wire spoke wheels, which mind you are tubed. You do not get tubeless tires. If you want alloy wheels, you can take them off the 250 and put them on this bike. Bajaj says you can do that, but you can't get them as standard from the factory. Now, being a scrambler, you would expect a scrambler style riding position, but that's not really the case. This handlebar is quite low by scrambler standards. There is a slight lean forward and you're definitely not sitting up like this. To me, if I didn't know what bike I was on, you just told me what does this feel like, I would say this is a roadster. And honestly, with the same chassis from the 390 Duke, the same adjustable suspension, compression, rebound damping in the front, rebound and preload at the rear, it really does feel like a roadster as well. The only clear difference to the KTM, at least on the road, is that the tires feel different. These are more adventure style off-road tires, Pirelli Scorpion Rally STRs. They look great and they give the bike that scrambler identity, but the turn-in doesn't feel as natural as it does on completely road tires, so there is a slight strange feeling there. You also have slightly different ergonomics, and maybe on the racetrack this won't be as nice as the KTM, but on the road it's a fun bike, but slightly different to the KTM. That being said, don't be fooled by the way these tires look, because they generate so much grip on tarmac that you will feel confident in leaning the bike all the way over. In fact, on a smooth and winding road, this thing can be just as fun as the KTM, even if it feels a little different. There's also a slight difference in the braking setup. The master cylinder, the caliper, the rotor, that's all the same, but this bike uses organic brake pads from the Duke 250. Now again, for road use, absolutely fine. I really didn't have a problem with it. Maybe if you decide to take this bike to the track with some better tires, you might want better pads. But for general use, it was absolutely all right. So what about the whole scrambler aspect of the riding experience? Well, Husqvarna themselves are completely open about the fact that this was designed to be a street motorcycle and meant to be ridden in a seated riding position. And you will feel that when you try standing up and riding off-road. There is quite a bend forward, doesn't feel very natural. Then again, of course it'll do it. You can take the bike off-road, there's no problem with that, but it's effectively the same as taking a 390 Duke off-road, and the only advantage you're going to have here is those Pirelli tires. The suspension travel is more or less the same, the ground clearance is more or less the same, and the only difference is that this bike has slightly less ground clearance, but it does have the added protection of a bash plate. So, you could take it off-road, there's a decent amount of suspension travel, but not really an off-road motorcycle. I like to think of it as a rugged street motorcycle. So where do these new Husqvarnas fit into the whole Bajaj ecosystem where you've got so much choice with the Triumphs at one end, the KTMs, and now these? The Husqvarnas are positioned below the KTMs in terms of price, but definitely higher than the Triumph Speed 400. The 401 is about 2.9 lakh rupees, which makes it about 20,000 rupees more affordable than the KTM, but you are missing out on some things. The Vitpilen 250 is also cheaper than the KTM 250 Duke, and that's a bike I'm really excited about because I like what the 250 Duke has to offer, and I think it would be really nice in a bike that looks like this. Ultimately, I really think it comes down to the looks. Why would you want to buy a Husqvarna over the KTMs? For me, it's for buying a bike that looks more sophisticated, more grown up, and definitely more subtle. The KTMs are wild, aggressive looking things, but those designs definitely aren't for everyone. Another thing I really like about the Appeal is that this is a more spacious and comfortable motorcycle for tall riders compared to the KTM. Ultimately, the Husqvarna's riding experience is very similar to the KTM, and this bike along with the KTM feel quite different to the Triumph Speed 400 because that engine is really focused more on bottom-end performance. The Gen 1 Husqvarnas were unique, unusual motorcycles that ended up appealing to a very small crowd. But this bike manages to keep much of that Swedish appeal while being a whole lot more practical. And I think that makes this a much more viable alternative to the KTMs this time around.